This is the last study of the two kingdoms, and I know it has provoked and agitated and educated many. My objective was to really teach people what is going on in the end times according to the Bible. I don't consider myself as an intellect or a scholar. I just believe what God says. And in this last study of the two kingdoms, I'm going to show you how you really need to be equipped and all the different things which are taking place in this world in accordance with Bible prophecy. The word Runnymede is a combination of two Anglo-Saxon words, running and meadow. As you walk through that greenery, you will come across a number of plaques that declares that Runnymede is the birthplace of modern democracy. But what exactly is democracy? According to Virtue's Concise Dictionary, it comes from two Greek words, demos, which is people, and kratos, power, the power of the people. It is that form of government which the sovereignty of the state is vested in the people and exercised by them either directly or indirectly by means of representative institutions. The United Kingdom praises itself as a democratic state, with cherished freedoms it has fought for that protects the individual against the tyranny of the government. But from the late 20th century leading into the 21st century, democracy has been cunningly under attack. In London, David Cameron proposes new powers to spy on internet users. Such a move would erode or do away with the values of European society: freedom, tolerance, liberty. But its Protestant principles are under attack. And the Christians who are alert to what is going on know full and well that it will lead to a wider agenda. But why the attack on what lay the moral fabric of British society? Radical leftists and cultural revolutionaries have always loathed the Christian religion. Why? They see it as a major obstacle to their plans. And what are these obstacles Christianity poses? They rightly see it as the ally of the family, of the rule of law, of private life, of individual conscience. Interesting. They campaign against these things under harmless seeming slogans such as equality and diversity and even tolerance. Deep. But as you walk through Runnymede to the Magna Carta monument, there is a lot of history. For the year 2015 is the 800th anniversary of the sealing of the Magna Carta, that superlative landmark in the evolution of the British state. And many newspaper articles in the British press are highlighting the importance of this document that protects its citizens' freedoms. But unbeknownst to the British public, there has been an intense struggle in the 21st century to do away with this document and introduce a kind of inquisitorial draconian laws where scholars have observed that if modern day terror laws are enforced, it would go against one of the founding principles of English law laid down 800 years ago in Magna Carta, that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned or outlawed or exiled or deprived of his standing in any other way, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. From Runnymede, we can make our way to Bury St. Edmunds, which is about 2 hours away, and you will see the ruins of an abbey that was destroyed by King Henry VIII. But on the remains of it are 2 wooden placards, and on them are the names inscribed of the 25 barons who instituted this law, and on the bottom line of one side it reads, "This is the second birthplace of our native rights." From Bury St. Edmunds we return to the south, and in Parliament Square in London, the Supreme Court, the final court of appeal in the UK for civil cases from England, Wales and Northern Ireland, it has a monument of the barons and King John sealing the Magna Carta, the cornerstone of British liberty and democracy. But there was a power that was very angry with these liberties. A power that still deceives the nations, the Papacy. And Pope Innocent III, the Prince of Darkness, condemned every portion of the Magna Carta. In a book titled The Magna Carta, published in 1914, it documented that a papal bull arrived in the end of September, dated to the 24th of August. This is an important document in which Innocent, in the plainest terms, annuls and abrogates the Charter. It goes on to describe Magna Carta as the result of a conspiracy and concludes, "We utterly reprobate and condemn any agreement of this kind, forbidding under ban of our anathema the foresaid king to presume to observe it, and the barons and their accomplices to exact its performance, declaring void and entirely abolishing both the Charter itself and the obligations and safeguards made either for its enforcement or in accordance with it, so that they shall have no validity at any time whatsoever." Thereafter, at a Lateran council, Innocent excommunicated the English barons who had persecuted John, King of England, crusader and vassal of the Church of Rome, by endeavouring to take from his kingdom a fief of the Holy See. The Papacy has not changed one bit. Its cardinals still dress in the same attire of the dark medieval ages, and it still operates as an autocratic hierarchical system, and it's just shocking that the Western media that praises itself as a democracy glorifies a system that is a bureaucracy, where the Papacy is open in how it functions, as this Catholic priest confirms.
The Vatican is the last absolute monarchy in the world today. The Pope, when he is elected, is answerable to no human power. He has absolute authority over the entire Roman Catholic Church, direct authority that reaches down to individual members. He is the supreme judge, the supreme legislator, and the supreme executive.
The Scottish intellectual James Aitken Wylie was a prolific scholar and writer whose works are just timeless. And in his essay-turned-book titled The Papacy in 1852, he forewarns us that these two tremendous forces, democracy and Catholicism, poise one another, and neither can reign so long as both exist. But who can tell how soon the equilibrium may be destroyed? Should the balance preponderate in favor of the Catholic element? Should Popery succeed in bringing over from the infidel and democratic camp a sufficient number of converts to enable her to crush her antagonists, the supremacy is again in her hands. Wiley knew the value of the Magna Carta and how it preserved the freedoms of the citizens of the British Isles, and in nearly all of his writings he recorded its value. In his priceless monumental work, The History of Protestantism, Wiley recorded that the northern nobles, who knew little about theology but cared a great deal for independence, would be masters in their own isle, and they let the haughty wearer of the tiara know thus when they framed Magna Carta. Turning to King John, they told him, in effect, that if he was to be the slave of an Italian priest, he could not be the master of Norman barons. On the 15th of June 1215, John signed the Magna Carta at Runnymede. This was in effect to tell Innocent that he revoked his vow of vassalage and took back the kingdom which he laid at his feet. Magna Carta was a great political protest against himself and his system. It inaugurated an order of political rights entirely antagonistic to the fundamental principles and claims of the papacy. Magna Carta was constitutional liberty standing up before the face of papal absolutism and throwing down the gauge of battle to it. In Wiley's book Rome and Civil Liberty, he shows us its relevance in our modern culture, where he said that the great principle conceded so early in the days of King John in Magna Carta, afterwards confirmed in the reign of Charles II in the famous Act of Habeas Corpus, and held by all statesmen who have flourished since to be one of the main foundations of British liberty, namely the inviolability of the subject save by the authority of law. But it's not just the foundation of British liberty. The United States is a young nation less than 300 years old, and its citizens are very proud of its liberties, and its erected monuments are a testament to its freedoms that can be traced to the Magna Carta. It was at Plymouth in the southwest of England that a group who have been labelled as the Pilgrim Fathers, the Puritans, left England to enter into the New World, and it was while on the Mayflower the principles of these Protestants, rooted not only in the Bible but also in the Magna Carta, that the foundations of North American freedoms were laid. The first insignia for the colony where the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts is a US patriot fighting for liberty with a copy of the Magna Carta in his hand. The founding fathers who inherited the legacy of the Pilgrim Fathers signed the Declaration of Independence in 1776 that separated the 13 colonies from the British Crown, based their liberties on the Magna Carta, and its chief architect was Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, who took the principles from England and expanded upon them for a wider distribution. James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, is known as the father of the Constitution and the author of the Bill of Rights, also rooted in British common law and the Magna Carta. The late Warren L. Burger was the 15th Chief Justice of the United States, and he documented that the Magna Carta was embodied in the whole fabric of North American culture. He said that the due process concept embraced in our Constitution traces directly back nearly 600 years to Runnymede. It is more than a technical legal concept, for it pervades our Constitution, our laws, our system, and our very way of life, that every person shall be accorded what is due. The Magna Carta monument in Runnymede was given as a gift by the North American Bar Association. For those in law know that they are totally indebted to the inheritance their Puritan Protestant forebears gave them, that is rooted in Runnymede. And Floyd Abrams, one of the most respected attorneys in North America, enlightened us of its benefits.
The First Amendment, remember, applies only as a protection against the government depriving people of their freedom of religion, the government telling them, in effect, who to pray or whether to pray at all, and in what way, and the government depriving people of freedom of speech or freedom of the press or freedom of assembly. I mean, at its core, it is a protection of human freedom by protecting against government overreaching. The adoption of the First Amendment has been an incalculable protection. I mean, America has always been the country in the world with more protection for speech, more protection for religion, those two areas in particular, more protection for freedom of the press, which together with freedom of speech have a sort of a common body of law, than any country in the history of the world. That's not to say we haven't had real big First Amendment problems sometimes.
This is what the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights says. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. But many are seeing that these Magna Carta Reformation principles are under attack.
If you take away a man's right to speak his mind in a country founded on that very principle, you don't really have a country now, do you?
There are those who claim that your ministry is intolerant and may even threaten the freedom of others.
Freedom is fragile and costly and must be defended by work and by faith, and even by blood.
Though many of the principles of the Magna Carta do not apply today, it is in one of the sections that protects us from tyranny that people hold on to not fall back into medieval brutality. The Inquisition was a horrific barbaric period in papal-controlled Europe, where you had no representative, no lawyer, but an inquisitorial tribunal. And the struggle that the English laws have been battling in Britain is to uphold that freedom in the Magna Carta, trial by jury. And a portion of the Fifth Amendment upholds that liberty to protect US citizens, where it says that no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury. But this seems to be one of the most heated and debated topics in this so-called international war on terror. Some of the most prominent senators in North America, who are all known as warmongers, are attempting to do away with that freedom of trial by jury with a bill called the Enemy Belligerent Interrogation, Detention and Prosecution Act of 2010, where the privilege of trial by jury is absolutely non-existent. The bill was introduced on March 4, 2010, but it was not enacted by Congress. But President Obama, on New Year's Eve, when everyone was distracted with ushering in the new year, signed a military bill titled the National Defense Authorization Act for the fiscal year in 2011, 1 year after the failed bill of 2010. And in section 1021 C.1, it reads that detention under the law of war without trial until the end of the hostilities authorized by the Authorization for Use of Military Force. But when will the hostilities or war on terror end, where there is indefinite detention without trial with no guarantee of release? And what is amazing is that law applies not only to US citizens, but anyone the US government sees as a potential threat. It is heating up. George Bush, the 43rd President of the United States, signed the precursor to the NDAA that undermines the freedoms of the Bill of Rights. The bill, House Representatives 3162, better known as the US Patriot Act, introduced a couple of months after the 9/11 attacks, does away with privacy. In section 216, it authorizes the government to install a tracking device that can intercept all internet traffic and activity and internet telephone communications. In section 215, the FBI can obtain books, records, papers, documents, or other items from your home if they feel it incites international terrorism. And in section 213, the Patriot Act can conduct sneak and peek searches of a person's home without a warrant, where they can just turn up at your home without notice. Now this goes against the safety measures in the 4th Amendment of the Bill of Rights that says, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized." As shown in a previous study, the man who is credited for the US Patriot Act was the 79th United States Attorney General, John Ashcroft, a Protestant who is a member of the Church Assemblies of God. But the real architect of the US Patriot Act was a Roman Catholic, Vietnamese American Viet D. Dinh, a Georgetown professor who served as the Assistant Attorney General in the Bush administration, who has been overlooked by most scholars when discussing that draconian act. The warning of Riley resonates when he says that if men in democracies side with the principles of the papacy, then freedom is over. Also shown in a previous study, a respected Jesuit in North America, the late John Courtney Murray, was one of the first to advise the American public to do away with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and forget the past. He documented this in his book titled "We Hold These Truths," the first line of the Declaration of Independence, where he says that, therefore, it might be possible within this new history to lay the ghosts of the past, to forget the ghettos and the auto de fe, or the act of faith, better known as the Inquisition, and Torquemada with his rack. The epistemology of the American proposition was, I think, made clear by the Declaration of Independence in the famous phrase, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Today, when the serene and often naive certainties of the 18th century have crumbled, the self-evidence of the truths may legitimately be questioned. So rapidly have the generations slipped beneath our feet that the prophets of modernity and its freedom, the Miltons and the Millses, the Madisons and the Jeffersons, have already begun to seem slightly Neolithic figures to our backward glance. Certain of their insights retain validity, but the adequacy of their systems can no longer be upheld. To summarize the words of this Roman Catholic Jesuit priest, do away with American freedoms. And that is exactly what the war on terror is attempting to do. And many can see what is happening, especially with the militarization of the United States police forces.
Men in Kevlar vests and helmets, camouflage, carrying automatic rifles, moving in tactical armored vehicles. These aren't American troops on the battlefield, but police in Ferguson. One observer says he thought he saw police in an MRAP.
An MRAP is a mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicle. It's built to withstand armor-piercing bombs. This is not something that we need in American communities.
But Kara Dansky of the ACLU says more than 500 MRAPs have made their way from Afghanistan and Iraq to local police forces in America just over the past couple of years. It's part of what the ACLU, in a recent report, called the excessive militarization of American policing.
The first portion of the Second Amendment reads, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. But the militarized police, with its armament from the battlefields of Iraq and Afghanistan, is turning the United States into a totalitarian state, a battlefield. And as shown in a previous study that was taken offline, the aftermath of the Boston bombings is a scale model of what the United States is going to enforce on a nationwide level, where house-to-house searches will be made for those who don't accept the enforced decrees that will not only be enforced on US citizens, but on the entire world. And to drive these ideas home in a type of psyops, America forewarns us through film.
Today, with the invocation of the War Powers Act by the President, I am declaring a state of martial law in this city. We intend to seal off this borough, and we intend to squeeze it.
Do you have any idea what you're starting here?
How do you shape the mind of a nation and the mind of the world, and train the planet to accept the United States as a global police force? Hollywood is the most effective character-building educational system program in the world. And though Even at the Doors has touched on this area in previous studies, it will dedicate a great portion of this study to its hypnotic effect. The narrator has covered a lot of this area by studying this book called Real Power. But we will not just look at the militarization program of Hollywood films, but the reprogramming tactics it uses to change your world view. John E. Bryson was the 37th United States Secretary of Commerce in the Obama administration. But prior to that role, John E. Bryson simultaneously sits on the boards for the Walt Disney Company and the Boeing Company. He worked for an arms and multimedia organization, showing the symbiotic relationship between the military and entertainment. You may see this logo come up at the beginning of films. It is by one of the most militarized-minded American film and television producers, Jerry Bruckheimer. Jerry Bruckheimer, Armageddon, Black Hawk Down, contributed financially to both George W. Bush and John McCain, and has maintained a close relationship with the Pentagon ever since Top Gun. But the military is not the only thing that is on the US program. Many Christians are struggling to keep a hold of their youth, and churches all over the world are losing them in record numbers. There are many factors, but here is one of the reasons why. Filmmakers like George Lucas introduced the war epic genre during the Cold War, and others have taken up the mantle in the Star Wars series, but that wasn't the only thing he promoted. When you sit down to watch a film, you are immersing yourself into another man's imaginations, his innermost fantasies, his pagan worldview, his idiosyncrasies, and many a times his unresolved childhood issues, where he can make you laugh or cry or even get angry as you absorb yourself into his make-believe world. He can even train you in less than 2 hours to hate an individual or group without you being in the least aware that you are being programmed. Keanu Reeves shot to fame, though already famous, by the two individuals he is interviewing, the Wachowskis. Their pagan worldview runs rife throughout their films. The Matrix series has biblical undertones to lure and deceive Christians, but its overall teaching is godless Gnosticism. In V for Vendetta, it glorifies terrorism and makes Christians look like a bunch of creeps. In Cloud Atlas, it promotes the lie from Eden, reincarnation, that teaches that man doesn't really die, but lives on and on through different cycles into different lives. And in Jupiter Ascending, God is totally rejected as the creator of this earth, and a similar message in the films Prometheus and X-Men Days of Future Past, that man was created or seeded by some alien race 10,000 years ago, seems strikingly aligned to the teachings of L. Ron Hubbard in Scientology. Some filmmakers' vision of a fantasy world live on even years after they have died.
What if there was a place where nothing was impossible? Where you could build whatever you're crazy enough to imagine. A place where you could actually change the world. You want to go? Buckle up! Tomorrowland.
Walt Disney wanted to create a false reality in people's imagination, a make-believe world. And Naomi Klein, the Canadian author, journalist and social activist, said in her book No Logo that back in the 1930s, Walt Disney, the grandfather of modern synergy, understood the desire to crawl inside the screen when he fantasized about building a self-enclosed Disney city. American and Canadian scholar and leftist critic Henry Giroux wrote a book called The Mouse That Roared, where he was amazed that Walt Disney shaped the public conscious by fusing entertainment and education without anybody challenging what was the overall message of his animations. But the most powerful work or critique on Disney is a book titled Walt Disney, Hollywood's Dark Prince, where it documents that Walt Disney was not only a spy for J. Edgar Hoover's FBI in 1940, but it documents Walt Disney's own words. Disney said, "I do not make films primarily for children. Call the child innocence. The worst of us is not without innocence, although buried deeply it might be. In my work, I try to reach and speak to that innocence." Walt Disney's repressed issues and inner struggles got an outlet where he expressed them in ink form in his animation. Mickey Mouse was his super ego, humble, chaste, cerebral, asexual, always in control and universally adored. Donald was his other alter ego, more darker, volatile, emotional, sexual, and out of control. These two products were a reflection of his issues. The film Bambi was a desire for Disney to escape and return to his childhood, and The Fire in the Forest is Walt Disney's angry acknowledgement of that impossibility. Walt Disney set the tone for the look of females in his animations, and many feminists have observed the gender identity for girls and women in Disney animations has a recurrent theme where they all generally look the same, a super attractive Barbie-like cutout in celluloid format, whether they are from the East in Mulan or are of African descent in the voodoo flick The Princess and the Frog. And women are either taught to be sexual and seductive like in Aladdin, or subordinate to angry men in Beauty and the Beast. But what is the overall message in the Gospel of Disney, where his theme parks are an outward display of Walt Disney's make-believe escapist world? What is the animation Pocahontas teaching us? And what is the overall message in one of the most popular and profit-making animations ever, The Lion King? And who or what exactly is Pinocchio's maker stroke father praying to? According to the London Guardian newspaper, it documents that when Geppetto, the woodcarver in Pinocchio, falls to his knees to ask for his puppet to be given life, he does not pray to God, even though his eyes are raised heavenwards, but to a blue fairy. Since Disney's death, the company has branched out into animism in Pocahontas, feminism in Beauty and the Beast and Mulan, adventure capitalism in Atlantis, and even Hinduism's circle of life tradition in The Lion King, which is set in Africa. The filmmakers in Hollywood know full and well that when they write that script or are behind the camera and are in the editing suite, it influences human behavior. Orson Welles has called film the best toy a boy was given. The Italian filmmaker Federico Fellini regards it as an imaginary theatre in which the filmmaker can act out his fantasies and give them substance. But the man who has had one of the greatest influences on cinematography, who is still praised by his church, is the Jesuit-educated Catholic Alfred Hitchcock, and the English film critic and author John Russell Taylor, who knew Hitchcock personally, said, "For Hitchcock is not so much in his films, he is his films. One can psychoanalyze all one wants to find evidence that his Roman Catholic education has left traces which still show up in his films." Films about repenting to a priest in I Confess. Though not one of his biggest epics, it is still praised by another student of the Jesuits, Mexican-born Guillermo del Toro.
Hi, I am Guillermo del Toro, and you're watching Trailers from Hell, and I'm here to introduce one of my favorite Hitchcock films, because I'm a fat, guilt-ridden Catholic, 1953's I Confess. This is one of the, considered a minor Hitchcock. It's not considered one of his masterpieces, but for me there is a gravity and a unique sort of kinky fetish with Catholic imagery and Catholic morale that makes it quite special for me.
When you observe Alfred Hitchcock's films, there is one overall theme that can be traced to his medieval Jesuit education: fear and murder. And he is praised by glamorizing these things. And his 1960 film, Psycho, that praises a nutcase, has still left a legacy that runs heavily throughout horrors. Brutally murdering another human being with a knife. And the cult-like film Scream has left its mark and its influence, where they know full and well it will have an impact. What about the man whose ideas were behind the film? Wesley Earl Craven is no stranger to struggle. Born in Ohio in 1939 and raised by strict Baptist parents, he had an unhappy childhood. The horrors of his often darkly comic films often spring from child abuse. His films are a product of his issues, but what does he say?
With the exception of Disney movies, I was raised in a very strict fundamentalist family, church, where going to movies was considered too sinful, except for Disney movies. So I did see all the Disney movies. There would be maybe one a year.
You sure you weren't a Mormon?
No, Baptist. But yeah, and I went to a Christian college too, where it was forbidden. So I would have been expelled if I had been caught. I hitchhiked to the next town and saw To Kill a Mockingbird. And literally that was like the epiphany for me. It was like, if this is considered sin, they got to be wrong. So that was my beginning of my exit. So
do you think that that religious background had gave you the reason to go into the dark cinema?
Well, you know, it's funny because it was such a pervasive lifestyle, and the mind was manipulated so heavily by all the adults around you. There's no way that it didn't have some influence in some way.
Another filmmaker who was inspired by Hitchcock, who also writes, directs, and makes cameo appearances in his films, also glorifies murder like Hitchcock. And Quentin Tarantino has often defended the gore that defies his movies, saying violence is so good. It affects audiences in a big way. It sure does affect audiences in a big way. And everybody responds to things differently, but the vulnerable and easily led imitate these films, and human lives are unfortunately lost by an individual or group acting out their fantasy by mimicking another man's fantasy. But it is not just violence that sells. This news report was shared with the narrator by a number of Christians about teaching Satanism in US schools. But if Christians were a bit more alert and concerned, they have been teaching Satanism for quite a long time now, shaping the mind of this generation. It is just not termed Satanism or witchcraft. These terms will put people's guards up. Today it is either called magic or an alternative to mainstream religion. There was a time that only goths were into the dark vampire culture. But the Mormon writer Stephanie Meyer made vampires and werewolves more appealing to mainstream society with her Twilight series. Trying to communicate with the dead was once seen as a no-go era. It was too dicey playing with a Ouija board. But Hollywood is making it more and more acceptable, and the more these pagan ideas are marketed, they slowly and gently break down your resistance, so that things that you once thought were horrific and disgusting 10, 20 or 30 years ago, you now have become desensitized to it, and unbeknownst to yourself, you'll end up defending it. This occult agenda is well calculated and timed and engineered to shape the thinking of the masses. And J.R. Tolkien's books turned films, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, is a part of that program. And in a book published in 1980 titled The Aquarian Conspiracy that outlines the New Age plan, the late Marilyn Ferguson documents that the media will be used to promote these ideas. She said that a generation in love with Tolkien's fantasy and Castaneda's sorcerer are ready for magic in themselves and in their children. All over the world, children and young people are being exposed via the communications revolution to such ideas. Two of Hollywood's most effective weapons are demonizing individuals or groups or distorting history. In the film The Patriot, Mel Gibson was lambasted by the British press for distorting historical facts, for he is known to have a big issue with Britain. This also shapes people's minds to past events and influences how they view the current world. In a book titled The War Against the Weak, it documents one of the most untold periods of American history, eugenics. Eugenics was a powerful movement bankrolled and supported by the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and the American Museum of Natural History, just to name a few. Where thousands were sterilized in the United States so that the next generation wouldn't be a burden on the state, so they can retain a superior race. It stopped around in the 1960s and 70s, but the most famous case was the 1927 Buck versus Bell in the state of Virginia. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr., who was the Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court, made the horrible landslide decision that has now been proven false, where an 18-year-old young woman by the name of Carrie Buck, who sits on the left, was deemed feeble-minded and unfit with a mental age of 9 and was forced to be sterilized. Though eugenics was imposed on all races, Carrie Buck was one of thousands of white Americans who were denied to have children or a family because they were deemed feeble. This was way before it was transferred to Nazi Germany. And to drive this idea home, the eugenics movement made a film in 1917 titled The Black Stork that showed a deformed baby. And rather than keeping it, the film promotes eugenic infanticide. Disgusting. The US investigative journalist Michael Parenti wrote a very powerful book in the 1990s titled Make-Believe Media, The Politics of Entertainment, where he touches upon an era that many usually skip over: the misrepresentation of blacks in Hollywood that shapes the nation's attitude. In the 1915 film titled Birth of a Nation by D.W. Griffiths, which was the first Hollywood blockbuster, it paints a frightening picture of the Reconstruction period after the American Civil War, where a white-robed Southern army triumphs over corrupt, villainous, hypersexual black legislators. It not only revived a dying Ku Klux Klan outside of the South, where it was endorsed by both President Woodrow Wilson and Edward D. White, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, but it seemed to unite white Americans on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line of the Civil War in their fears of a racial uprising. This false portrayal of blacks caused a reaction where Oswald Garrison Villard, a founder of the NAACP and owner of the New York Post, decried the film as a direct incitement to crime. It is a deliberate effort to arouse racial prejudices and to injure a large class of our citizens. That didn't stop it. School children throughout the country were taken to see it in order to learn history, and it was re-released in 1921, 1922, and 1930, and continues to be featured as a classic and in the university film courses as a landmark production of early cinematography. But Hollywood attempted to counteract it many years later by propelling an interesting character.
He's so calm and sure of everything. He doesn't have any tensions in him. He knows what he believes and what he thinks is right and why and where he's going. Mom, this is John.
Sidney Poitier was the type of African American that people would find acceptable. He was nice, clean-cut, a middle-class saint who had patience, integrity, and self-control, who didn't fit into the bigoted stereotype of the angry black male, never lowering himself to the level of his adversaries. And Hollywood was showing black America, this is the type of man we want next door, moving away from the stereotypes of the birth of a nation. But the black gangster genre emerged 2 decades after the blaxploitation films in the 1970s. And what have been the end results? Well, an increase in black-on-black violence, according to Ebony magazine, at the release of Boys in the Hood. If America already has a generation of angry black males, and Hollywood promotes more films with angry black males, denying black directors to move out of the stereotypical images of making people laugh, hypersexual, or downright arrogant, then the end result will be breeding more angry black males. For recent studies have shown that all over the United States, especially in Chicago, that has been nicknamed Chirac, black males are still dying at alarming rates in the toughest urban pockets. They represent 6% of America's population, but account for 40% of its murder victims, according to one study cited. And men who have profited from the vulnerabilities and issues in their own communities, who are from middle class and well-respected homes, still promote films that doesn't help to heal the community, but keeps people in a place. For unbeknownst to your average person, Hollywood is controlled by a corporate mentality, and the upper echelons are more liable to discourage critical, investigative, or responsible films rather than directly encouraging the opposite. Hollywood not only shapes the mood of the American nation, but skillfully promotes American foreign policy by targeting a group who it sees as an enemy. During the Cold War, the communists were targeted as a global enemy in films like Red Dawn, where the most prominent actors promoted the US agenda. And in more recent times, the film The Interview psychologically prepares the world for an up-and-coming conflict with North Korea. And the film American Sniper, as shown in a previous study, is a cleverly constructed anti-Muslim flick. That precious document, the Magna Carta, and its cherished liberties is really under siege. And not knowing the past makes it very difficult to understand the present. And though Amnesty International conducted a survey all over the world in 2014, where most people said they were against torture and its ghastly horrors, Hollywood glorifies torture in its films. And the late Charlie Chaplin wrote, produced, directed and acted in a film which looks like it is talking about the war on terror.
Even now my voice is reaching millions throughout the world. Millions of despairing men, women and children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
What we're dealing with here is potentially a global war that requires constant diligence in order to suppress. You do know we're at war, right? Our enemy, they do not want to negotiate.
Gentlemen and ladies, soldiers of the United States Army Reserve, welcome to Abu Ghraib. This is the largest United States enemy detainee facility in the world. We hold some of the world's most dangerous terrorists here, the worst of the worst.
So here's the deal. You have to be aggressive.
What's this?
Stress position, technique we use to soften them up.
You're supposed to be doing this?
Make no mistake about it. This is a war zone.
Ted Hutt, honor bound.
Freedom. Some of these guys have been locked up in here for 8 years.
Do you like it here in Guantanamo Bay?
It's been a very long time that I have been waiting.
One of your guys here, he told me that he knows I'm innocent, but I still cannot go home. No country, no city will take me because I've been here.
You and me, we are at war.
As Americans, we have a profound commitment to justice. So it makes no sense to spend $3 million per prisoner to keep open a prison that the world condemns and terrorists use to recruit. Since I've been president, we've worked responsibly to cut the population of Gitmo in half. Now it is time to finish the job, and I will not relent in my determination to shut it down. It is not who we are. It's time to close Gitmo.
You know, let me tell you, this is a fun job.
Right.
Every day I wake up and I get a bird's eye view on what's going on everywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. I can have as much of an impact on the things that are important to people as anybody on the planet.
Right. With the 44th President of the United States not secretly but openly declaring the power of his office, and with Hollywood's ability to shape the mind and thinking of North American citizens and re-educating the planet's worldview by distorting history, targeting the vulnerable, embracing another man's issues, reinforcing racial stereotypes, desensitizing our minds to occult and pagan philosophies, and presenting America as the one and truly only global player, we will close this study by outlining her plans.
There has been much discussion and debate concerning the dangers of nuclear war. And now nuclear war is in fact considered to be part of the humanitarian peacekeeping missions of the United States and NATO, and that there is a preemptive nuclear war doctrine, namely that you wage nuclear war to prevent war, so to speak.
Asia, the world's growth engine, where fortunes are made, deals are sealed, and opportunities seized in the blink of an eye. Here, nothing is more expensive than a missed opportunity.
Today, our businesses export more than ever, and exporters tend to pay their workers higher wages. But as we speak, China wants to write the rules for the world's fastest growing region. That would put our workers and our businesses at a disadvantage. Why would we let that happen? We should write those rules. We should level the playing field. That's why I'm asking both parties to give me trade promotion authority to protect American workers with strong new trade deals from Asia to Europe that aren't just free, but are also fair. It's the right thing to do.
The eventual threat to the United States is China. That's a problem for the United States, so that by 2020, something like 2/3 of American naval and strategic forces will be in the Asia Pacific. Japan, Philippines, Korea, encircling China. And really the encirclement of Russia is related to that, because the Eurasian landmass is absolutely critical to this new emphasis in American policy being successful. Who controls it?
As shown in a previous study, geopolitician Zbigniew Brzezinski wrote a book in 1997 titled The Grand Chessboard that verifies and confirms what journalist John Peel just said. And when reading it, you will see that the 43rd President, George W. Bush, and his war policy, and his successor, President Obama, and his geopolitical war policy is part of a well-calculated plan. Look at the word the narrator highlights in red. China's growing economic presence in the region and its political stake in the area's independence are also congruent with America's interests. American foreign policy must remain concerned with the geopolitical dimension and must employ its influence in Eurasia in a manner that creates a stable continental equilibrium with the United States as the political arbiter. Eurasia is thus the chessboard on which the struggle for global primacy continues to be played, and that struggle involves geostrategy, the strategic management of geopolitical interests. Russian geopoliticians know that whoever either controls or dominates access to the region is the one most likely to win the geopolitical and economic prize. Ukraine is a new and important space on the Eurasian chessboard. The brief, punitive mission in 1991 against Iraq have made that economically vital region into an American military reserve. Have you ever wondered why ISIS just sprang from nowhere in Iraq? Have you ever questioned why President Assad has been a target by US foreign policy? Why US Secretary of State John Kerry condemns the Russian channel RT?
To promote, actually, Russia Today Network has deployed to promote President Putin's fantasy about what is playing out on the ground.
And why NATO is expanding a military force in Eurasia to combat Russia. That whole region, Eurasia, is one big energy resource economic prize with pipelines stretching far and wide. And once you can understand that scenario, it will become a lot more clearer why the United States is arming Ukraine. Not because they care for the civilians, but for the United States' geostrategic self-interest. It lies between Europe and Russia. And many believe that the United States secretly colluded with Saudi Arabia to lower the oil prices to cripple the Russian economy. For the US and its allies have imposed sanctions to punish Putin's annexation of the Ukraine region of Crimea. Combined with a sharp drop in the price of oil, the sanctions have pushed the Russian petrostate to the edge of recession. Worst of all, the value of the ruble, the national currency in which its budget is denominated, has collapsed by almost half, according to Time magazine. And as Russia is aware that the US is using a very nasty and subtle economic weapon to cripple her, she has also threatened to turn off Europe's gas supply for the damage Europe has caused Russia with the pressure Europe gets from the United States. But America's role is still a lot bigger than most people expect. Carefully look at this map of the world. The United States has targeted every region on the entire planet as command centers. No space on Earth is spared. You have the United States Southern Command in Latin America, and that is currently overseen by General John F. Kelly, who checks that region. Admiral William E. Gortney oversees the United States Northern Command that oversees North America and Canada. You have the United States Africa Command, also known as AFRICOM, that is currently overseen by General David M. Rodriguez, who checks the wars and terrorism in Africa. You have the United States European Command, and General Philip Breedlove oversees that mission, as well as NATO's role in Europe. And General Lloyd J. Austin III is the commander of US Central Command that oversees the conflicts in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and that whole region of the East. And let us not forget the oldest and the largest, the US Pacific Command, headquartered in Hawaii, that, like the US Central Command, covers the East in Asia, but also the countries in the Pacific, where it is headed by Admiral Samuel J. Locklear III in the most militarized region in the world. In the US magazine Foreign Policy, the May-June 2014 edition asks a very serious question. Why does the United States have over 8,000 soldiers stationed in peacetime Kuwait?
I want to extend my welcome to the Emir of Kuwait. We are grateful for his visit.
More broadly, why does a country so seemingly determined to avoid another land war need a large standing army with troops all over the globe? With a military budget of hundreds of billions of dollars, far outstripping the military budgets of all the world's armies combined, what are America's plans for the future? We shall see.